Hi, I'm Nathan, a developer at Livefront, and this is Telling Your Code Story with Commits. As software engineers, we tend to focus on the software that we create. We don't think about the process that goes into making that software. But engineers do much more than create software. We also tell stories. In today's talk, we'll talk about how we tell stories. We'll look at defining a few words so that then we can get into the nitty-gritty of looking at an example of poor storytelling, coming up with some goals and guidelines. So what do I mean when I say that we are storytellers? Well, products change over time, and as they change over time, we add new features, we fix bugs, and we release new versions of those products. But all of that is driven by our commits, and our commits tell the story of our product's changes, line by line. Why is story important in Git? Well, well-crafted commit messages are much easier to read, which makes them easier to follow when read together, one after the other. They don't leave you guessing at what's in the commit. And if we write better commit messages, then we are able to tell better stories. If we tell better stories, we can build better products. So let's define a few words before we get into the nitty-gritty. What is commit history? Well, history is just a list of commits, but you can also look at it as your story's timeline. Here's an example story timeline. This is a list of Git commits from a project of mine, and we'll look at this again later. So now that we've looked at what history is, what makes up the history is a commit. And what is a commit? Well, a commit is just a group of changes. That can be code, images, anything. It's just a change from one thing to another. This is an example of what a commit looks like in GitHub. And a commit is made up of several different parts. You've got the message, the author, so that's who created the commit, the date that they created it, and then a unique identifier, also known as the hash. But the two things that we'll be touching on today are the message and the hash. With those definitions in mind, let's look at an example of some poor storytelling, which will help inform us on how we can come up with some goals and guidelines going forward. So this is a list of commits. So this is commit history from one of my projects back from college. I think I was writing a lexical parser. So let's look at a few of these commits in more detail. Commits are listed in reverse chronological order. So the ones at the bottom are the oldest ones, and the ones at the top are the more recent ones. These first three aren't that bad. They're actually pretty well laid out. It tells you what's in the commit before you even look at the commit. These next three, not so much. It's pretty confusing. And this last one's back to making much more sense. So let's look at a few of these in more detail to tell why these ones are really good and these ones are not so good. Well, these first three commits are very specific and informative. It's pretty easy to tell what changes are in these commits before you even look at the contents. But this other one, working perfectly now, nothing to worry about, tells you nothing about what's in the commit. You have no idea what's going on, and you'd have to dive into the commit and look at the code changes specifically to try to see what's going on. And you can see all of these together, even though some are good and some are not so good. Looking back at the full history again, you can see that even though some of these commit messages are well laid out and some are not, the ones that are not make the story incomplete. So now that we know what not to do, let's come up with some goals for writing commit messages that tell better stories. So how do we tell a good story? Well, we want to make sure that our commit messages add context. They're also informative, so they tell us what changes are in the commit. They're specific and concise, so they don't ramble, and you kind of just want them to be nice and short, like a tweet. And you want to make sure that all of your commit messages have a very similar structure. This makes it a lot easier to read when you're reading them one after the other and you're trying to decide which commit you should look at. So now that we have some goals, let's set some guidelines for writing good commit messages. I like to structure commit messages as a sentence. So I use the commit hash as the subject of the sentence. And I begin each message with a verb. You can use past or present tense, but I tend to use present tense. Some examples of those verbs might be adds, removes, changes, fixes, and more. You should also capitalize the first word, but you don't want to end with punctuation. This just cleans up the commit message and makes it easier to parse. You also want to explain what has changed in the commit message, but you don't want to put the why and the how. If you want to explain why or how for any of the changes in the commit, then you can use the commit description instead. And you also want to keep it short and sweet. Like I said before, structure it like a tweet. So let's break down an example of a good commit message and look at each of these guidelines and how it applies to the commit message in this example. Here's the commit we'll be looking at. This is how it looks in GitHub, but let's look at it like we see it in terminal, because this makes it a little bit easier to see the sentence structure. Reviewing the definitions that we talked about before, here's the hash and here's the message for this commit. So first, let's look at its structure as a sentence. We have the commit hash as the subject. You see the commit hash here would be like the first word in the sentence. Then you follow that with the message, and we begin the message with a verb. Here we're using the verb fixes. Next, we want to make sure we're capitalizing the first word in the message, and fixes is capitalized, but you don't want to end with punctuation. It keeps things looking a little nicer and tidier as you read one message after the other. You also want to explain what has changed. In this example, you can see fixes the config initializer. It's pretty specific about explaining what exactly is in this commit before you even look at it. You also want to keep it short and sweet. And in this example, the message is only 28 characters. That's perfect. If we look at this example from earlier when we defined commit history, you'll see that each one of these commits follows the same guidelines that I talked about before. Not only are well-crafted commit messages easier to read, they're also better at telling the story of your product's changes.